Good morning, everybody. We're up to episode 44.
44. Good morning. Hey, Kathleen.
And it's June 4th, so it's 444.
Ooh, does that mean like the aliens are coming today or something?
It means the robot birds are going to be activated.
Woohoo!
We'll get to see what it was all about.
That's right. The pandemic, the robot birds are fired up, and they have been spying on the protests.
The time is at hand.
Yeah.
So today we're talking about Antifa and Trump, and my brain is already tired thinking about what I'm going to say.
Yeah, so Mark is a real expert on this, so we're going to let him roll, and hopefully at some point he's going to lose it like he did the other day. And
yeah, he's hoping to see Grumpy Bear Mark again. I guess it's good for ratings. No, but this is a good one for questions and comments, because there's so many pieces to this. We're talking about what Antifa is and how it relates to the broader kind of, I would consider, revolutionary left movements. So Antifa, people who are involved in Antifa are usually think of themselves as Marxists or anarchists. It's usually kind of what we think of as the far left, and they're usually scapegoats and considered just as bad as the far right. And then, of course, there's the angle of how Trump is using this, what the narrative purpose is for him. And
so is Antifa a strange Italian word or something? What does that stand for people who don't know?
Well, yeah. So you can get a single shot of espresso double, which in Caribou coffee is called moosing it. And anytime you get a third extra shot, it's called Antifa.
Right.
That's good. It's short for anti-fascist. And most people think, oh, yeah, I'm against fascists. But Antifa in particular is a set of, you could call it a movement or a set of tactics that is more militantly anti-fascist, where it isn't just, hey, I don't like that. There's a set of assumptions in it. One, that legislation enforced by the police against fascism won't work because the police are part of the fascist problem. So therefore, instead of relying upon legislation enforced by the police, we will engage in direct action to stop fascism from spreading. And so there's a set of tactics that different people use. The only one people ever notice is punching Nazis. Or if there's any kind of other violence, they assume, oh, somehow Antifa is like black bloc anarchist actions, and we're going to lump all that into violent leftism. And so anytime there's any looting or property destruction now, it's probably Antifa and white supremacists. That's the level at where people are at, that's not an Antifa tactic.
Right.
Antifa tactic is releasing information about high-profile white supremacists so that that person is shamed or put at risk. Punching Nazis, deplatforming right-wing speakers from speaking at college campuses, exposing things, also all about exposing and putting pressure and shaming, and eventually even making it physically risky to be a white supremacist or a fascist. That's what Antifa is.
Right.
Period.
And it's not like one group. You can't go to antifa.com.
There might be now, but it's probably owned by white supremacists spreading lies.
Right. So it's not one group. It's not one organization. This is more a sort of sense. And again, for those who have not been involved in movement work, who are not familiar, I mean, within any given movement, there are many, many groups. There are many, many ideas about strategy and tactics. There are many different understandings about, how hard we have to push the system, what is going to get us results. There's always a lot of conversation, argumentation about that. That's perfectly normal. And so this is generally a group of people that feel that they look at these guys showing up with AK-47s and rocket launchers, and they look at the rise of fascism, and as Mark said, they basically consider the cops to be on their side, and we've certainly seen that when hundreds of people with automatic weapons show up at a Capitol. Not only are they not met with rubber bullets and tear gas, but actually the entire legislature just gives up and goes home, which is not what happened here in Minneapolis. And so, yeah, there's a group of people that say, we have to get a lot more active about this, and we have to be much more confrontational. And again, you can agree or disagree with that, but that is, as I said, a very normal thing in movements, that you have a whole diversity of opinion about how to address them.
Questions and comments are already coming in, so let's start getting those.
I'm glad that Gus knows about the robot birds. Right. So the pandemic was a fake thing so that the robot birds could get their batteries changed.
Yep. And Gus is our guest tomorrow. We're going to talk about those people experiencing homelessness in times like these. So thanks for keeping the truth alive about the robot birds.
That's right. And bring one of them to the talk tomorrow. Capture one.
On Hell writes, can you talk about the roots of Antifa? I mean, basically, there have always been kind of left-wing people pushing back against right-wing stuff, but we really see this in the rise of Nazism. Mm-hmm. So you'd have people way before we ever went to war with Nazis, the brown shirts were, and before they even came to power, brown shirts were wandering around Germany, like in Berlin and stuff, and causing racial hatred. And so you had Antifa people, anti-fascist people, going and saying, get out of our neighborhoods, Nazis, and like getting into street fights with them, trying to push them out before it rose to anyone else's conscience. That's what Antifa does, that sort of things. And then you really see it in the Spanish Civil War with, which was largely a left-wing war against fascism. And so you had people from around the world coming and being a part of it because they didn't want to see fascism spread. So you had people from the United States, other parts of the world coming to join with the people fighting against fascism in Spain. So it's a long tradition. And again, you can disagree with tactics, but just lumping them in with white supremacists because they do tactics you don't like it's stupid. I mean, I'm just going to say it's stupid.
Or at least grossly ignorant.
Tomatoes, right? And now I'm not talking about intellectually stupid. I'm talking about ethically stupid. Kathleen writes, I have never heard of Antifa until Charlottesville. I also don't know what the term anarchist. Yeah. Basic definition of anarchist are those, traditionally it's those left-wing, like socialists who don't believe that you can get at it through the top down, through the state. It comes from the bottom up. So it's anti-authoritarian socialism, basically, with range of most social democratic socialists would probably be close to that definition too, but the anarchists are kind of further left and more anti-authoritarian.
And again, I mean, with these questions, which are great, and we really appreciate them, and but what they do bring up, right, is how ignorant of history America is.
Yeah,
right? And that we really are this ahistorical people that know very little about history, even get a sense that history exists, right? And so, the mid to late 19th century and then early into the 20th century, there was a tremendous rise of all kinds of socio-political thought and movements that really were an inheritance of a lot of the socio-political thought and reflection of the early Enlightenment. When societies were starting to develop liberal political systems separate from the church. And so there were many different thinkers that were looking at this whole question, right, of how do people live together? How do we function as a society? How does power function? What are the best kinds of systems for good? What are the ways that we can have a society that we can all live in and function in, right? And so all of these isms, all of these groups, they all come out of that, right? And then the great struggles around the world in the 20th century, in many ways, were struggles coming out of those different ideological positions. And again, the vast majority of us in America know almost nothing about any of that. And so one of the things when, white people say, what can I do? One of the things you can do is learn about this stuff. Like just, dig up some resources, Google anarchists or Google the history of anarchy, read some things, send us emails and say, what would be a good book to read? And really learning about this. My guess is 99% of Americans don't even know what the Spanish Civil War is.
Yeah, that's true.
But it was a very important attempt to stop the rise of fascism in Europe that was ruthlessly and brutally crushed.
And I should walk back on my stupid statement earlier, because to me the idea is stupid, but how are we supposed to know any better? I've spent so much of my time learning about this stuff, and I'm kind of a lay scholar, and so I wish we had more truth telling from people who are in the position to tell that truth, and we don't. Which gets to the Trump thing in a little bit, but a lot of questions coming up.
Let's keep rolling.
Colin writes, Trump's move to criminalize anti-fascist action is telling on himself, but also an attempt to criminalize dissent in general. That's right. Though he lacks any legal mechanism for doing so. He has loopholes to work with. Still, this makes me very nervous as a step towards enshrining punishable thought crime. Yes. Because right now, the executive branch is singling out Antifa, and you have most Americans, all they know is that Antifa is bad, so they're not really putting up resistance. And this is a way for criminalization of anyone who has leftward thoughts, right? There's a reason the KKK has never been listed as a terrorist group, but now the Antifa they're trying to list us as a terrorist group.
Right.
Yeah. Could Bonhoeffer be considered Antifa? I mean, for sure, before, when he was just generically resisting it, yes. But then, especially when he was willing to take more militant actions. I mean, I would not assassinate Hitler. I'm not one of these I would assassinate Hitler if I had a time machine people. But I understand that impulse, and that to me is kind of that impulse to deal with things directly at the root is an Antifa approach.
And again, the creation in everybody's mind that this is this bad, evil group, is part of this, as Colin is saying, suppressing dissent in general and part of this divide and conquer thing, right? And one of the most moving things over the last couple of years as Trump has come to power and basically is supporting white nationalism. And if you don't believe me, just go to a white nationalist website, which actually will say, Trump is on our side. So, this isn't a radical idea. The white nationalists are saying this. Some of these interviews I've heard with World War II veterans, these 80, 90-year-old guys who are like, I got traumatized going to Europe to fight fascists. All my friends died fighting fascists. And now suddenly we think this is a good thing. And it's heartbreaking for them and also really confusing. So the notion that being against fascism is somehow bad, we need to consider whether that's maybe a problem.
Billy says they took a lot of history out of the schools. That's the problem now, I think. There's definitely political selectivity in what's making it to various curricula. Susan writes, our history has been fed to us in a very particular way. And unless you're working really hard to dig deeper for truth, you'll never know.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's
absolutely true. So even when history is still there, it's slanted and told in a very particular way. Yeah.
This is a good one from Angel. We know very little about our knowing very little. So then we see a swarm of memes. For example, MLK to domesticate his life by saying he never threw bricks, burned. Yeah, like the domestication of MLK is a great example of this. Like, how many of us white people think we understand all we need to know about MLK, and then incite him as an example for the nonviolence we think we should have in our society. Right. It's simplistic.
Right. And actually, one of his kids tweeted the other day, because black folks are getting really disgusted by, MLK quotes taken out of context from white people. And one of his sons tweeted the other day, white folks, you need to remember that before my father was assassinated, he was the most hated man in America by white people. So they actually did a poll. Who do white people hate the most? And it was MLK. So, yeah, let's keep rolling with the comments.
Carol disagrees with Billy. Our young people are really well informed, good at expressing themselves. I credit school for latter and internet for former. I mean, I think there's truth in that. I think it's messy. Like, depends on the school, location, the teacher, like to what extent are they informed? Like I have to do a lot of home education because schools will only go so far because they have to aim for the middle. But I will agree that the weird echo chamber of the internet and its tendency towards misinformation in these times is certainly toxic.
Yeah, and I guess, Carol, I would say my experience is that a lot of young people may be well informed about some of the things going on now. I would still say they generally are very poorly informed about history. But yeah, there's pockets of difference, of course.
Yeah, and so my son, who's 12, goes to a very progressive school where they still until recently had the pageant where somebody, in this case, a Somali kid was dressed as an indigenous person with a headdress reenacting the first Thanksgiving. So like that kind of way of framing history still happens and it's flawed, but I doubt he'll ever learn about the Spanish Civil War. Yeah. So I mean, it's what's the emphasis? Colin writes, Brueggemann writes that empire creates a space, quote, in which history cannot happen, end quote, because the hope of the poor is rooted in memory. An empire thrives on distracting people into preoccupation with an eternal now. I've been thinking about that while watching our politics ever since I read that line. There's a lot of juice in that statement. I do think, this idea of creating like this is some totality of your existence. Don't hope for something different in the future, and don't find roots in anything other than that in the past is definitely the way empires work. It's disconnecting us from our roots and thinking that things can never get any different than the way they are now. Yeah, and that's part of
Yeah, and actually, I just saw that in action in a very powerful way at this event where some indigenous folks and some white folks were getting together to talk about water issues in northern Minnesota. And this white biologist gets up to talk after this very powerful Native woman got up to talk. And of course, she began with talking about who she was and her roots and ancestors. The white guy gets up to talk, and he, of course, just wants to immediately launch into water biology. And she stopped him and she said, well, who are your people? And there's just this silence, and he just like looks around and he was just, he had nothing to say, right? Because again, that whiteness of the empire creates this ahistorical space where, well, I don't have a people. I'm just here to talk about biology, right? It was really interesting.
Well, so without that context, if you're stuck in the ever-present now, or if we're going to use that language, and you see someone dressed up all in black punching a dude without having any sense, you're going to be like, oh, that guy must be bad. Why is he punching that poor man? I mean, I think that's kind of the place where we're stuck. So it's like, again, I'm not saying I'm really happy about people getting punched in the face necessarily, although some people, if it stops them from being publicly fascist, then I think that's relatively nonviolent compared to what could happen otherwise. Let's just be honest. But the lack of context in history causes us to misdiagnose problems all the time. Yeah. It's why, like, the police do a really good job hiding their violence, and so we tend to think the people they're fighting are more violent than them, and that's not usually the case at all. Ed writes, thank you for speaking to this. As a historian, I appreciate your call to look at where we come from. It is the lens through which we bring our world into focus, sitting on the bridge of our nose. Even if we are unaware or forget, we are wearing lenses.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. Amen.
Billy writes, history is my favorite class. I look at my son's book. It's not close to what I learned from school. It's a little battle going back and forth about modern education. I like it.
Yep. Keep rolling.
Joseph, I recall MLK went through a process of weighing use of force versus nonviolence. My understanding is that he became persuaded toward nonviolence by A.J. Musty and others as being most effective means and consistent with his faith tradition. Is Antifa's approach a step in our evolution towards nonviolence? Personally, I'm conflicted as there may be times when force is necessary. I mean, the civil rights movement, the larger movement was not just MLK. So there was a whole bunch of folks. I mean, you have Malcolm X, then you had the right, SNCC, you had the rise of the Black Panther Party kind of within that larger movement. Within white folks, you had groups that were supporting the Black Panther, but most people didn't. And you had groups like the Weathermen who were engaged in property destruction. It was a huge movement. Right. And so some of MLK's gains came because of the more militant sides of things. We got to be honest about that, even though people committed to nonviolence. Yeah,
there's actually a great book that I would recommend to everybody called "This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed." And it's really an analysis of the interaction between MLK and the nonviolent folks who came down to the South, who, by the way, were those evil out-of-state people that came in to protest.
Out-of-state agitators.
Out-of-state agitators. And the local Black folks who lived there, who, basically the thesis of the book is that these local folks who said, look, you can go ahead and be nonviolent, but I live here and these white folks will kill you. And I'm not giving up my guns, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to be nonviolent all the way to the end, right? Like when they come after me, I got my shotgun on my porch. And the thesis of this book is exactly what you just said, Mark, is that these folks were able to sort of serve as a shield for the nonviolent protests that, again, were not nonviolent, right? You've got the beautiful picture of them marching across the bridge in Selma, and you seldom see the picture of them being attacked by dogs right afterwards, right? And so, so we have to have a much more full and nuanced view of the interplay between nonviolence and violence. And again, what we have to keep coming back to, and this is what Trump's thing is trying to deflect from, the most violent actor in all of this is the state.
Yes.
So that is the most violent actor in all of this. And and that's what they want you to not think about.
And that their violence is normalized. That's why we don't notice it.
Mm-hmm.
So when we keep talking about these violent protests, and we're not talking, including the police and how we describe the violence, then we're not telling the whole story. It's just we somehow believe their violence is legitimate. This is part of what's at the core of this issue we're dealing with right now, all across the world, even now, like there's protests everywhere. It's a question of, why is your violence legitimate? It's not just that you broke the rules, as Dan has pointed out recently. Like, I don't know if we talked about it on air, but like that's kneeling on someone's neck is actually in the police manual.
Right.
Right? Even if they're all following the rules, there's still a violent force. It's not just that there's a few bad people who break the rules. It's legitimized violence. So getting back to what Joseph, you're saying, is this another step in the evolution? I hope so, because to me, a pacifism that lends itself towards you sliding towards a disengaged middle is beyond worthless, because it becomes part of the weight of the status quo. If you're committed to nonviolence, it needs to be nonviolence with teeth. It has to be agitated and aggressive nonviolence that as Bayard Rustin says, it tucks your bodies into places so the wheels don't turn. You have to really be engaged. Otherwise, get that nonviolence out of your mouth. I'm on the edge of getting
but I'm not. He's going.
I'm pulling back. Series writes, sadly, criminalization of leftward and or radical visionary thoughts is not just in America. France has banned protests against police brutality against Black people. There's a reason why there's people protesting around the world. It's not just because they love America or they're even though they know enough about George Floyd, it's because they recognize this as part of the larger struggle against colonial and white supremacist oppression.
Yep.
Series writes, how does one deal with family, neighbors, peers also reinforcing criminalization of radical visionary thoughts on behalf of the principalities and powers unconsciously?
Yeah.
Oh my God, that's a big question.
Yeah, that's a big question. But again, and I've recently been writing about this and in some of my videos. I think this is one of the key activities for white people. And I've actually heard many of the black folks on the street calling for this. Us and again, this is kind of nonviolent action, right? Us white folks have got to get a lot more assertive about calling out this crap. But this one woman yesterday is a black woman on the St. Paul School Board. I still can't remember her name, but she was saying, you need to talk at Thanksgiving to your cousin. You need to speak up in your workplace. You need to speak up in the boardroom. You need to go to a city council meeting and speak up. Right. And when we just let this slide, right, that's not nonviolent action. That's complicity. So let's keep the comments rolling because we got a lot. This is great.
Yeah.
I love it when we get all these great comments.
Yeah, I wish we had more time.
On fire.
That question of how do we help our friends and family go deeper on this is a big one. Hopefully we'll get more of that in the future. Gus writes, one pre-Panthers civil rights groups that wasn't nonviolent was the Deacons. Really interesting and never gets any play in these histories. So there's a link there I'm going to leave up. So it's not, there's so much depth to the history of this stuff, of the struggle for justice, that we don't, even for folks who are really try to be informed, it's hard to keep up with all of it. There's really a loss of memory in our society. So the link's there. You can always rewind after this is done to find it. So let's keep moving. Nate writes, as a follower of Jesus and someone new to this anti-racist work, my quick reflection is that Jesus was violent towards property, turning over tables, but never towards people. I'm going to jump to this question from Jeremy too, just to talk about this one. So is violence justified ever? What about for Jesus followers? Is it different? I always slice and dice the violent question differently. I don't think it's violence if it's property, unless you're destroying property to intimidate oppressed people. But personally, as someone who's committed to Jesus, I'm committed to not physically harming another human being in a way that can cause anything permanent, restraint. I'm willing to do that, but I'm not willing to put that on everybody, especially if they're more oppressed than I am.
Yeah. Well, and for me, again, I feel like the way this question gets framed is always a distraction.
Okay.
Because usually the way it's framed is, are the protesters being violent? And is that good or bad? And so to me, until we're ready to talk seriously about the violence of the state, I don't even want to entertain a question about whether or not, burning down a Target is violent and is that good or bad. So when we have a $750 billion defense budget and nobody wants to talk about that, and there's not a single politician in Washington that wants to vote against that, except sometimes Bernie Sanders, I don't, that question to me is a distraction. The focus needs to be incredible pressure on the state. And because they are the most overwhelmingly violent actor. And so until white America is willing to rise up against that, this other question to me, it's just silly.
Yeah, and I think when we look at it as well, I am against that stuff, Dan, but I'm also against this. To me, it's just like having a flat view of scripture. I don't like flat views of nonviolence. You have to understand what's the core of this violent system. And if you focus too much on the response to that violent core, then you're basically reinforcing the violent core.
Yeah. Well, and again, I've got to really question when somebody says, oh yeah, I'm against that, and they never advocate for candidates who are against that. They are never in the streets activating against that. They are never speaking out against that. They've got a, we support the troops thing out on their lawn. They think, then I have to question whether or not they're really against that. I think, again, until you put your body where your mouth is, I'm going to be somewhat suspicious of how much you're really against all of that.
Yeah. Back to the school question. Regarding school, it depends. Despite how good many of my professors were, never once did I hear of James Baldwin in a class. It took a friend quoting him in conversation in 2016 and me being the only person in the circle not knowing who he was for me to find out. I then read The Fire Next Time as soon as possible, but I was livid about not knowing of him sooner. I didn't know about James Baldwin until I was well over 30. Mm-hmm. Most of this stuff I didn't really know until I passed 30, because I went to a rural elementary, middle, and high school, and I went to a fundamentalist college, and then I went to a seminary. I've done stuff since then, but I never learned about any of this stuff in any of those places. Joseph says nonviolence with teeth. I like that. I also sometimes say nonviolence with a healthy dose of fuck you. The sensationalized and Hollywoodized images of people looting and burning is a far better sell in mainstream media than the bourgeois behind closed doors signing off violence, cutting out people's access to education, health, livable wages, etc.
Yep.
This is part of what is meant by the banality of evil. Like it's unimpressive when the most violent acts in our world start with things that are really unspectacular looking, with people who don't even realize what they're doing. Colette writes, I think you are so right, but do you not think that actions like this give police a reason to attack people?
No, absolutely not. And
they're attacking anyway.
They start the attacking. And again, 10 days ago, we marched peacefully down to the 3rd precinct, and we were attacked. And that's what you've seen everywhere around the country and everywhere around the world. So again, even that idea in people's heads of it's like, oh, the protesters start the bad stuff and then the police just respond. That is actually not what happens. And so it's very important, if that's what we're seeing on our TVs, it's very important for us to question that, because that's not what's going on.
Yeah, and even in this case, the idea that Antifa is involved, as far as I know, there haven't been huge attacks against the police. The whites, to me, the Antifa action, with these neighborhoods organizing to be prepared to stand up to white supremacists rolling into the neighborhoods to cause trouble, that's an Antifa type action. These other actions are not. Like burning down Gandhi Mahal is not an Antifa type action. And so buying into this narrative that they're somehow doing all this destruction makes it easier for then Trump to push. The thing that's enabling Trump to become more fascist isn't the actions that we think of as Antifa. It's people somehow naming and vilifying the left so much that it justifies Trump. And so they have middle America enabling fascism because they're misdiagnosing the problem and they're buying the lies and false narratives rather than looking at what's true. That's what's causing this. So this is a militant, we were talking before, we talked about a militant left and militant right. This is what the militant middle looks like, where you're basically willing to allow extreme violence to maintain the status quo, but because it's so normalized, we don't consider it extreme.
And there you have it.
Yeah.
So we've gone a few minutes over. Thank you all. Again, when the comments are rolling in like this, it's a lot of fun.
But we're past time.
We're past time. And so tomorrow, Gus is going to be bringing some robot birds to fly around the room, and we'll see how they work. And that'll be great.
And then after that, we'll talk about how folks experiencing homelessness, how this has been for them from Gus's perspective, working with his friends who are experiencing homelessness. So it'll be important. And I think that's a part of the conversation that isn't really happening very much.
Right. Thanks. Bye.